What's up, TOK people? This is the last video, last video that I have to make tonight. I'm trying to power through here. So, while you're gonna be gone, especially Team One, just want to get some information about ethics because I know a lot of people are thinking about how to include ethics into their essays and what that means, and it's a little bit more than just thinking about what's right or wrong. So we want to think about how we use that within the knowledge framework of how we build knowledge through ethics. And really, ethics is focused on morality and what is right in a situation. So just a little bit of intro. There's my favorite ethics professor right there, Chidi from The Good Place, who can never make up his mind, which is a common issue within ethical dilemmas. So the term or the terms moral and ethical are usually used interchangeably, like that was an ethical decision or as a moral decision, or as an ethical dilemma it's a moral dilemma. But it's important to kind of make this specific distinction. So not so much with what's ethical, but what is ethics. So moral kind of means what is right and wrong. These are ideas about what is just, what is good, what is honest, what is virtuous in society. But ethics is an area of knowledge that examines that sense of morality and like the moral codes that we develop. So it's a way of looking at things that is kind of developing how we know about what is moral in society or the right way to live, I guess. So ethics as an AOK is a little different than a lot of the other areas of knowledge because it's almost exclusively just on critical argument. So basically, you're just critiquing behaviors and methodologies. You're not actually like doing experiments. There are some inferences that are being made and some induction that's being made, but it's really just like a critical argument about critiques of behaviors and what that means on like a broader scale within different contexts. So it's a little bit different, it's a little unique in that way. So I'm going to go through the knowledge framework. And again, these are things you're going to want to use when you're talking about ethics as an area of knowledge. So the general scope and application of ethics is understanding goodness and moral choice and what that means and if that's relative or if that's absolute. That's a huge thing that we'll get to in a second. But it's really just let's focus on how people should be. So in economics, for example, there's positive and normative economics, and positive economics generally means that you're just describing the way things are. You can also think of it as being empirical sciences versus normative sciences. So normative is like how things should be. So things like natural sciences, maybe a naturalist interpretation of human sciences are for very positive or just kind of like empirically stating the way things are. Ethics is generally normative, saying this is how stuff should be. That's an important distinction to make if you're going to be comparing ethics to another area of knowledge. So there's a couple different fields of ethics that you can talk about when you're talking about the scope. So it really depends on what type of ethics you're talking about. So the first type is called meta ethics, and that's probably the least common that you're going to run into, which is this issue of looking at the nature of ethical knowledge. So like looking at ethical knowledge itself as a knowledge issue. It's got some interesting concepts here, and these are things that I think you should think about using. The first being sorry, Blair Witch Project stick figure there. Ethical relativism. So this idea that ethics are dependent on culture and context, and how different societies and different cultural groups can have different codes of ethics, and that's okay, and that's just a way of studying the perspective of that area of knowledge versus some ethics philosophers who would say that there's this thing called absolute ethics, which means that certain standards are universal. So there's just this idea that like there's certain types of morality that should cut across all cultures, and it doesn't matter. And if a culture, some might even go as far as saying if a certain culture doesn't believe in that type of morality, that's just it's an inferior belief system, that we have absolute ethics that we should have. So one example of that kind of combines them a little bit is this idea of the golden rule. And you can see, so this whole idea, like it goes back to Confucianism, which is like treat others or do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Basically paraphrasing a little bit there. But you can see examples of this throughout most major religions across the world. So there's just some examples of how that plays a role. So even though it's like a little bit different, it's a little relative, there is kind of this absolute knowledge that's formed in this idea of the golden rule. That's kind of fascinating to think about how it just permeates across most societies, whether it be Western or non-Western. So meta-ethics is kind of the ethical study of ethics. Then you get down into normative ethics, which is how do we know whether we are doing the right thing? So this idea, like we did this activity regarding like if Michael should tell his friends about the affair that they're have engaged in, or like the trolley experiment, like how do we know what's right? Heinz dilemma is another example of moral development and normative ethics. And then the last one, which is where you get more into modern ethics, is applied ethics. So how does ethical thinking apply to situations in society? So how should we use this knowledge that we've gained to actually make our lives better? And does it play a role in developing policy, or in how we interact in our day-to-day life? Or is it more something that we should just think of and kind of think about the right way, or maybe individually strive towards and not move it into shared knowledge? So a couple different things about the scope. It really depends on what you're looking at and how broad or very drilled down specific you want to be with it. These are perspectives in normative ethics, so I figured I'd just kind of throw those out there because there are perspectives even within this scope. So different philosophers will have different things that they're looking at within ethics. One example would be this perspective that you're focusing on what's called the moral agent, or the person actually doing the action. So how do you look at the morality or the ethics of that person, the person that does the action? So you can think about their intentions. You can think about their character, is the person of good character, and how do you define that? And this approach to philosophy is generally called virtue ethics. So it applies to specific choices. So like when somebody makes a choice, is that virtuous? What does it say about their character in general? So looking at the person doing the actions. There's also this idea of that we've kind of talked about in class before called deontology, which is where you look at the choices themselves. And the moral agent recognizes duties or obligations and formulates so that you kind of have these like absolute moral principles that you're studying, and you're looking at the features of choices and looking at how the morality and the universal principles reveal themselves through that situation. Sometimes they're based on religious teaching and being accepted through faith as well, these kind of like absolute beliefs about what the right way is to live your life. You could also be a consequentialist. So we talked about that as well in the trolley problem. So you would maybe put an emphasis on the actual people that are affected by the choice and thinking about the outcomes of what happens. A lot of times this is based on observation or thought experiments, and it's sometimes called utilitarianism or consequentialism. They're not necessarily the same thing. Consequentialism would be looking at the consequences in total. Utilitarianism would be taking that a little bit step further and thinking more about how is it impacting the greatest good or affecting the greatest good for the greatest amount of people. And then the last thing you could do is you can kind of look at social context. So that the moral agent kind of acts as expected within the specific context. So this is kind of where like relativism kind of comes in. Sometimes they look at like this idea of what is care or caring for people. So thinking about how the moral agent acts out of concern for the welfare of others within networks or relationships. And in philosophy, it's usually called the ethics of care. So kind of thinking about the context of the situation and what that says about the person as opposed to the actual person themselves and like what absolute things about them are coming out. So again, I kind of think about like when you're thinking about an ethical situation, there's different ways that you can think about this, but you probably gravitate towards one or maybe two. So think about like what is your perspective, and then when you're bringing in those real life situations and you want to talk about ethics, maybe think about how you can apply these different normative ethical lenses to a situation. And then the last one is pretty simple, but just the methods of ethics. So there's a lot of emphasis on like thought and argument. So creating clear guides to moral action. You generate and usually test these through some kind of analysis or thoughtful analysis. So there's a couple examples, like the classic example of if you could save your child from death, but it would cause a small village across the world to completely die, would you do it? Or on the flip side, what if it were the opposite way around and you could save a small village across the world by killing your child? So thinking about like thinking through that and reasoning through that would supposedly enlighten you towards the ethical truths or ethical knowledge that is presented. Philosophers and people in general, ethical dilemmas negotiate between these abstract principles and then the application. So it's one thing to say like, and we've talked about this in a couple of the thought experiments we've done, that like in this situation you would do this, or this is the right thing to do, but and then put in that situation, can you actually apply those ethics to that situation? So that's kind of one of those like knowledge issues, is like understanding something in a thought experiment is one thing, but actually being able to apply it to specific cases. And then they try to make general statements about what should be done, which can be hard depending on the context and what we call false equivocation fallacies, where you have different situations that maybe appear to be the same, but there might be something that makes them inherently different, and therefore you can't always apply the ethics to every situation. So there's a lot of interesting kind of folds and wrinkles to think about, and we're going to try to apply this to natural sciences overall. We might do this discussion activity in class, but thinking about what makes a choice moral. So is it more about the fact that the person, or sorry, people generally say that the two criteria are that the person makes a choice consciously and the action has to affect someone else, but are there possible counter arguments you can make related to ethics in those situations? So hopefully it gives you just like a little bit of intro into some things to think about related to TOK concepts when you're talking about the area of knowledge of ethics. And we'll talk again about more like some of the intricacies when we're in class. All right, so have a good night, and we'll talk later.